We're just waiting for our participants to join us, to step into the room, and in about 2 minutes, we should formally start the proceedings of this webinar, right? So, okay, I would like to kick off the start, and hopefully, as people come in, they will join us. They will meet us along the way. So, so good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to one and all. Thank you for joining us today. Wherever you are, I hope you're in good health and spirits, and peace be unto you. I want to give thanks to our panelists, Rania, Philip, and Andrew, who so generously gave us their time, excuse me, and place their beautiful energy and insights for our collective benefit in this webinar. Let me also, while I'm on the floor, acknowledge the multi-skilled, multi-talented webinar organizing team. I want to start with Thomas. Thomas, can you just show us your face? Thomas is in the southern part of India. Then we have, in the northern part of India, we have Joseph. Joseph, you can show your face, please. And then coming westward, we have Daria. Daria is based in Cyprus. Yes, Daria. Okay. And then we have Phil. Phil is based in Tanzania, in East Africa. Phil, can we show us your face, please? Great. And then Peter. Peter is based in Spain, right? And right. And I am Gino Govender, and I'm based in Johannesburg, South Africa, and I will serve as your webinar host, moderator for the series, right? I'm looking forward to a good interaction with all of you over the next 90 minutes. What we'd like to do, just so that we can get a sense of how we want to run the webinar, I'd like to bring in Daria. We'll spend a minute or two just explaining how things will work for this particular webinar so that we can get maximum participation and interaction between all of us. Daria, please come in.
Great, thank you, Gino. I hope I'm audible. Great. So my name is Daria, and I'll be behind the screen today, along with the rest of our team that Gino just introduced, listening in and there to support the conversation. But just a few notes before we begin. The chat is open. You should all be able to interact with the chat. We'd love to hear from you. To begin with, it would be great if you could tell us where you're joining from and your area of practice or struggle. And as the conversation unfolds, please do share what you're thinking. In particular, there will be a few moments of pause throughout where we'll just sit with what we're hearing and reading and can reflect back the things that come to mind in the chat. If you have a question for our panelists, please do use the Q&A feature and not the chat, as this will allow us to track the questions, the specific questions coming in more easily, and we'll try our best to get to as many as possible within the time that we have. And lastly, I do see some people are asking about the recording. The webinar is being recorded, and for those who would like to revisit it or to pass it on and share it with others, please do get in touch. We'll make it available for you. We'll also be documenting and reflecting on all of the conversations and input from the chat as part of the larger process of deliberation and study throughout the next couple of months. That's all from me. Back over to you, Gino.
Okay, thank you, Daria. So, folks, just by way of a kind of background and introduction, I'd like for you to think about the image of Earth from outer space. They call it the blue planet, the beautiful planet, right? And if you think about Earth in relation to the other planets, you know, we are kind of tiny speck. However, in this speck, this tiny dot, right, in several parts of this world, this beautiful planet, on every continent, there are horrible, deadly, unjust wars underway, each with their own histories and context, most about exerting power over others, other people. It's about dispossession and control of their territories and exploitation of their natural resources. These wars and conflicts undermine or violate the global architecture of dialogue and peace as embodied by the United Nations, its various agencies and regional bodies, for example, such as the African Union, that have a peace mandate. The cost of war, so-called defense spending, funded by taxpayers of the world, is going up regularly, increasing. It's not coming down. So too are the profits of the arms corporations. Sadly, for those working class and poorer sections of populations that rely on governments for public service, they are hit with imposed austerity measures and cutbacks in social spending that meets basic needs, such as water, education, health, housing, and so on, including rising food prices. Ordinary people, civilians, innocent civilians, if you like, pay the ultimate price for wars with their lives, their homes, their communities, their social and economic infrastructure, their histories, their cultural heritages, and their natural environments. And all of these things have been built over a century, decades even, but can be destroyed in a minute. What can we do? In every corner of the global world, social justice organizations and solidarity movements, people work hard with meager resources, with their hearts, with their hands, and their heads, tirelessly fighting violence, challenging injustice, and promoting peace through collective action. I want to draw our attention to the wise words of Martin Luther King Jr., who once said, "Those who love peace must learn to organize as effectively as those who want war." Sorry about that. Right. And if we, what the hell is this? Sorry, I don't know what's going on here. Sorry, that was my phone. My apologies. If we, the peoples, want peace, we must be just as organized and sometimes even more sophisticated than those who want war. This is the historic task of our generation, as it was for those of our forebears who built two powerful grassroots movements in the 60s, one for peace and the other one, the fight against apartheid. As they say, we, our generation, we stand on the shoulders of giants. Now, to contribute to sustaining hope and a vision of peace, And to build momentum to end violence, the Global Social Movement Center, that's called MOVE, it's an Action Aid project for people, has organized a series of 60 90-minute webinars to deconstruct and understand violence, right? And to reconstruct pathways towards a just, enduring, and peaceful world from below and beyond borders. We hope these webinars will be safe spaces for analysis, insight, reflections, sharing, supporting, for education, for collaborating, and for building something useful, building mass awareness and understanding, and amplifying grassroots voices for peace and justice. The organizing team identified in the last webinar where we spoke about speaking of violence, the team identified 6 takeaways that emerged from the inaugural webinar, that is the one that we launched last week, that was held on the 29th of January. So I'll ask my colleagues here to post these onto the chat box for your recollection and, of course, for your reference. Okay. In this webinar, this is webinar number 2, where we speak about In Another's Land, War and Militarization. In this second webinar today, we hope to explore the historical and contemporary dynamics of war, militarization, and external aggression in global geopolitics. We will also focus on how current power struggles continue to threaten world peace. Understanding the global arms race, if you like, of course, is critical to understanding, and to understand the direct connection between wealth accumulation, politics, and state power. Now, brothers and sisters, before we move on to our first panel speaker, I would like us to pause and observe a few minutes of silence as a prayer for peace. We will take a few moments, not more than 30 seconds, as a way of all of us in the Zoom room coming together in a solemn way to pause and as a prayer for peace. I ask you to sit comfortably, hands at ease on your side or on your knees, to close your eyes, focus on your breathing, and focus your thoughts on honoring and remembering someone we know and those in faraway places whose lives were cut short through war. We also honor those peace warriors who dedicate their lives at the service of humanity and those who fight for peace and justice. I thank you. And now, I have the pleasure of introducing our first speaker, who is Rania Mazri. Rania is a human rights activist, an environmental scientist, a university professor, and a writer. She is the co-director of the North Carolina Environmental Justice Network and an expert in what is known as the Court of Conscience, and which presented testimony on the environmental impact of the 2006 Israeli war on Lebanon. Rania is also a juror in the Merchants of Death War Crimes Tribunal. I had the opportunity of meeting Rania and listening to her presentation of that report, and I was deeply inspired. And really, I was so encouraged, Rania, to have you as part of this particular panel. May I say that Rania she likes to refer to herself as a descendant, if you like, of Greater Syria. And I found that very, very fascinating when we go into history. So, Rania, it is my absolute pleasure to welcome you. What we would like you to do, Rania, is to share some of the key insights that you think is important in the context of this particular webinar on war and militarization, and what you've learned from that Merchants of Death study. Over to you, Rania.
And thank you, Gino. And it's a pleasure and an honor to be with you. I must start by saying that although I currently live in the United States, I stand with you as a victim of war. I have lived through war, and my people continue to live through war. And I think before we talk about war, we need to contextualize that we're talking about human lives. How many people here have experienced war, felt the reverberations of bombs ravish their cities, been panicked if your loved ones were still alive, cried over loved ones whose bodies were shredded by weapons, and all the while being told by the mainstream press from the United States to Western Europe that your people are the aggressors, even though they are merely trying to survive on their land. We know that wars are fought over resources. Actually, let me speak more clearly. We know that mass murder campaigns, which is what wars are, mass murder campaigns are led to steal resources, to steal water, land, oil, minerals, etc. But they are also conducted for the use and marketing of the weapons themselves. I will focus my intervention on the largest current imperial force, a country that has led mass murder campaigns almost every year of its existence, founded on expansionist settler colonialism, the genocide of indigenous communities, and the theft of African bodies, the United States. Almost 100 years ago, a US Senate investigation found the weapons industry in the United States guilty of bribery, lobbying, arming both sides of conflicts, and sabotaging disarmament efforts. The Senate investigation called the weapons industry international racketeers bent upon gaining profit through a game of arming the world to fight itself. That was 100 years ago. It has only gotten worse since. The US is now the world's #1 institutional polluter. The US has nearly 1,000 military bases and forward operating posts and constantly seeks to expand. And every year, the budget allocated to the weapons industry continues to get larger every single year. Currently, the US spends as much on its military as the next 7 countries combined. And now there is a talk of increasing military spending by almost 90%. As a juror in the Merchants of Death Tribunal, I heard evidence of the sociopathic crimes of the weapons industry, evidence of their influence to generate ever greater profits by killing people. They fabricated enemies, they manufactured wars of choice, and then presented the wars as advertisements for more weapons. As the great Arundhati Roy said, once weapons were manufactured to fight wars, now wars are manufactured to sell weapons. To achieve this, the weapons manufacturers have bought the US political system through lobbying and through shaping the narrative of enemy creation via think tanks and control of mainstream media. False consent is manufactured through the press, where representatives from the military-industrial complex are 4 times more likely to be interviewed by the press. Meanwhile, the mainstream press censors communities like mine who are victims of the war. And it does not stop with the press. In Hollywood, the Pentagon and the CIA have exercised direct editorial control over more than 2,500 films and television shows, glorifying war and making racism as patriotism. In the past 20 years alone, US weapons have killed more than 4.5 million people and have led to the dispossession of 38 million people. And since wars are fabricated to steal resources and promote weapons, then all those killed in their homelands, be they combatants or non-combatants, are innocent. And we need to be very clear with our narrative here. It is the right of a people facing a foreign military to fight and defend themselves. All those killed by US weaponry outside the US borders are innocent. To get away with such large-scale murder, the fighting becomes glorified and our lives become demonized to such an extent that the murder of our children becomes justified, and our children are not even looked at as children, but as young men and women. 5-year-old children in Gaza presented by the mainstream press as young men and women. Our killers become politicians and inventors and engineers, normalized by directors and actors and producers and journalists. Our days and nights are cloaked in mourning. And the epitome of that suffering is occupied Palestine. In 1 year, Israel dropped over 85,000 bombs on Palestinians in Gaza, nearly 6 Hiroshima atomic bombs, dropped on a very small sliver of land. Every single bomb dropped on families in Gaza was dropped from a US-made plane. 300,000 Palestinians have been killed in 15 months, pulverized by 2,000-pound bombs, had their skin burned by white phosphorus, children targeted by sniper drones, and they even used weapons that vaporized the bodies of people. People have been vaporized like in Nagasaki. All the while, the murders are live streamed and used as advertisements for the weapons to be used elsewhere, coming to a country near you. And now a local North Carolina company, UG Solutions, is offering veterans to go and staff military checkpoints in Gaza. So we see the continuation here of the horror. Gino asked, what can we do? Well, the Merchants of Death Tribunal sought to hold the criminals accountable, and we found the weapons manufacturing industry guilty of aiding and abetting the US government in the commission of international war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. We named the CEOs of Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Raytheon, and General Atomics. The American Foreign Service Committee also has a list of companies that has profited from the genocide. We need to hold them all accountable. And we need to shift the narrative to highlight those of us who have been killed under the brunt of the bombs, and to recognize, and I'm going to throw this out here and please ask me about it, to recognize that the liberation of Palestine will result in the liberation of the United States. Thank you.
Gino, please unmute yourself.
Yes, yes, Rania, thank you for that opening, if you like. I'm at a loss for words. I can only say thank you for bringing it to our attention in the way that you did, and with the emotion that you brought into the room. I could feel it, that you were literally right next to me. So thank you for that. What I would like to do is to just maybe ask our everyone just to observe a few seconds of silence to absorb everything that Rania has said and to reflect on it. And if you'd like to post something onto the chat box as part of your reflections, you are most welcome to. The liberation of Palestine will be the liberation of the US. May I, with due respect and with all the humility, say the war that the Palestinians are fighting is a war that they are fighting not just for the US, but for all of us, Rania. If the Palestinians lose, as you said, coming to a place near you, and what the Palestinians are teaching us about their resistance, I think many, many nations and many struggles throughout the world can learn so much from the brave resistance of the Palestinian people. Thank you. Thank you so much. You can keep an eye on the chat box, if you don't mind. What I would like to do is to introduce our next speaker, Philip Daza Sierra. Philip is a professor at the University Sciences Po Paris and part of the International Institute for Nonviolent Action. Philip specializes in civil resistance, public advocacy, and human rights. with over 2 decades of engagement with nonviolent movements and activists in the Middle East, North Africa, Eastern Europe, and the South Caucasus, he contributes significantly to global peace, nonviolence, and human security efforts. He is also the founder and researcher at the Shock Monitor Observing Spain. Philip has done a lot of work in understanding the war in Eastern Europe, in particular, the war between Ukraine and the Russian Federation. He has done so much of work trying to understand, the militarization of those two countries, and as immense insights, if you like, to offer this particular panel as a case study. Philip, without further ado, I'd like to hand over to you, and welcome, and really appreciate your presence here. Thank you.
Yeah.
Over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Gino, and also thank you, Rania, for starting with this very important presentation. In fact, my learning or my first experience with civil resistance, with nonviolent civil resistance, was in Palestine, and this is my first tradition of nonviolence action from the popular committees from Bilain, Ilain, Budrus, that they were struggling, against occupation and the confiscation war in 2004 and 5. But before I talk more about the importance of civil resistance, as a solution, to deal with the ongoing militarization of our societies, I would like also to bring more, let's say, topics to the discussion. So later on we can elaborate. But I think, as Rania was mentioning, I think militarization of the huge military spending is one of the key, priorities for the peace movement. But I think there is also other phenomena that we need to pay attention. And I would like to focus on the privatization of warfare and security. As you know, 2001, Afghanistan, 2003, Iraq are the most privatized armed conflicts in our history. So hundreds of, British, US, private military and security companies with the experience of, let's say, apartheid, government of South Africa, which provides the resources and ideologies and experience. They occupy and they invade these two scenarios, and with the aim not only to, let's say, to perform combat operations, but at the same time also to ensure the plundering of natural resources of the Iraqi people, for example. And this is also something that I would like to highlight, that mercenarism is, as you know, is not something new. But we since 2001, we observed like a turning point in this industry, with new companies emerging, new services, like, for example, combat operations, intelligence services, protection of extractive sites, contracts with multinational corporations. We have shown that we also observed that from our conflicts, how these, private corporations, private military and security companies have been also providing services in the UK prisons, also providing services in borders all over Europe and all over Latin America. So we see that there is an evolution of this industry, and more in recent days, we also observe a penetration of these companies in what we call, on the use of high advanced technologies. So cyber mercenarism is a growing trend as well, and we observe multiple private contractors also offering services on mass surveillance and cyber espionage, not only of other businesses, but especially, to social movements and activists across Latin America and other countries. I can go deeper on this topic, but I would like also to connect also this element with the current context of Ukraine and the use of mercenaries by Russia. I think that the case of hybrid warfare by Russia and the use of PMSs like the Wagner Group is also very, very interesting, because it shows also how a military contractor was not only using military, or implementing military services, but also using what we call non-traditional activities or non-traditional military actions. Like, for example, using disinformation to polarize societies, how to use communication strategies and propaganda to increase the public support in Russia to the war in Ukraine, but also to increase the recruitment of young people, Russian young people, into the Russian army or into the Wagner group. So this is a very important, turning point as well in what we call the process of privatization of warfare. And I think that there are some intersections of this capacity of propaganda with the far right movement, especially in the case of Russia, the Russian imperial movement and the Rusic force had alliance and had been cooperating with at that time with Prigozhin in 2022 through military bloggers, through cinema, through social networks, through different channels, to increase the support and to change the mentality of the people. So I would like to also to highlight the importance of not only about the military component, but also the war mentality. The culture of war is a key element to understand, to justify, the military expenditure. And I would like to finalize that with another key idea that we can discuss later on is about also, as you know, the war between Russia and Ukraine also reinforce or strengthen NATO and increase the military spending of EU countries. Recently, Mark Rutte, the NATO Secretary General, was declaring just a few days ago, saying that we need to increase the military expenditure and allocate healthcare and social services funding into the military, bringing us not only to this increase in military expenditure, but also bringing us to a war mentality. And I think that is also important. I will stop with that in this process also we have the ongoing process of marginalizing a peace and non-violent alternative to confront the challenges we are facing as a humanity. And I will keep it here so later we can go deeper.
Again, thank you so much, Philip. Again, I will ask everyone to just pause and try and reflect on the key issues that Philip raised and reflect on it. And again, if you like, you please feel free to post it into the chat box. Thank you, Philip. I think, Philip, if you don't mind, what I would like to pick up on, and we can always come back to it after Andrew has spoken, is the idea of non-violent civil resistance. And I think it'll be great even if Rania could come in and all the attempts that peace builders, if you like, people that are opposed to war, what is happening to them, particularly in your study, but also if you have evidence of across the world. I know in many countries in Europe, there are attempts to suppress those who are very active in the front lines of the struggle against war, right? But we can come back to that, the idea of civil disobedience, Philip. So thank you so much once again for that. And then finally, it is my pleasure to introduce my fellow countryman, Andrew. I was going to say, when you say, Andrew, an ANC MP, I'm not sure if everyone else around the world knows what the ANC stands for. It could be anti-nuptial contract, right? So Andrew is a former African National Congress member of parliament who resigned in protest, if you like, of the government's refusal at the time to allow an investigation into a massive corrupt arms deal that involved a few famous global multinational arms corporations, right? And Andrew, at that time, there were a few others, members of parliament, that also resigned in protest against the arms deal around the bread, not guns kind of sort of campaign. But Andrew is also the author of Shadow World, Inside the Global Arms Trade. And there's also an award-winning film of the same name. After the Party, and he also wrote After the Party, Corruption in the ANC and South Africa's Uncertain Future. And recently, co-edited Monstrous Anger of the Guns, How the Arms Trade is Ruining the World and What We Can Do About That. He is working on a new book, Making a Killing, How the West Profits from Slaughter in Gaza and Yemen. He's the founding director, and I like it when you say, of a small organization called the Shadow World Investigations based in London. Andrew, it is my pleasure. I would have loved to speak about your ancestral history, but I would leave that to you, just so that people can get a sense of your, particularly your position on arms and war and stuff like that. So, Andrew, it is my pleasure to hand over to you, but specifically, what, as a liberation fighter, Andrew, what is your investigations, your shadow world investigations, telling you about the state we're in from a perspective of humanity? Andrew, over to you.
Thanks so much, Gino. Can everybody hear me okay? Great. First of all, thank you so much to the organizers for putting this series together and for the invitation. And to Gino and my extraordinary fellow panelists, thank you. I'm not sure that there's a great deal I need to add after what the two of you have said. I think your coverage of the state of the world is depressing, but extraordinarily apt and accurate. Very quickly, in terms of my background, my mother was a Holocaust survivor in Vienna during the Second World War. She survived the Holocaust, in which she lost dozens of her own family, mainly in Auschwitz. She survived the war by being hidden in a coal cellar for 3.5 years. She then met my father in London after the war, who took her back to South Africa, where he was from. And she very quickly started to realize that Black South Africans, the majority of South Africans, were being treated like the Jews of Europe had been treated by the Nazis. And of course, the underpinnings of this racism, this oppression, was identical. It was racist white supremacy, not dissimilar to, unfortunately, what is causing the situation in Gaza today. But I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. What I want to add to the brilliant inputs from my two fellow panelists is that we need to understand that, in theory, the global trade in weapons, which is the most corrupt of all trades, accounting for over 40% of all global corruption, is supposed to be regulated both by domestic law, by regional agreements, and by international treaties. The reality is that those laws exist on paper only, that the trade in weapons is totally unregulated. For instance, in most countries of the global north, most weapons-producing countries, the legislation states that no weapon should be exported if by that export it is increasing the likelihood of civilian casualties. Now, for goodness sake, how, given that the global north has been arming Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates to commit war crimes, violations of international humanitarian law in Yemen for over 9.5 years, how, while we watch the world's first live-screened genocide, and I have lectured at Auschwitz on genocide prevention, and while I'm very proud of my own country, South Africa, for bringing the case to the ICJ, we didn't need the highest court in the world to tell us that this was genocide. All we needed to do was to listen to the Israeli political and military leadership. How can we claim that the arms trade, that global conflict is regulated, while the most powerful nations on the earth, who produce the vast majority of the world's weaponry, are providing weapons that have killed over 62,000 civilians in Gaza alone? It's a nonsense. So why does this happen? I've spent the last 23 years documenting in my various books and films how corruption in the global arms trade effectively oils the wheels of our political systems. So when Britain does an arms deal with Saudi Arabia or with Israel, and £6 billion of bribes are paid, like on the Al Yamama arms deal, that money doesn't only go to the Saudi royal family, to Benjamin Netanyahu and his close associates. Some of that money comes back to Britain in the form of what we call the feedback principle. And that money lands up in the hands of our main political parties and our senior politicians. To give just one example, Tony Blair personally has made over £110 million conservatively since he left office from the companies who benefited from the invasion of Iraq and his association with Britain's main arms producer, BAE Systems. And I can give you the same examples as I have them in my books in Germany, in France, in Italy, and of course in the United States of America, where it's a system of legalized bribery, where we can actually trace the money that goes to individual politicians and the billions of dollars worth of contracts they give back to those companies once they're in office. The reality is that we in the so-called West or global North have the best democracies money can buy, because our political systems are bought and paid for. When our MPs run for office, they don't run to represent us, the voters. They run to represent their billionaire donors and their corporate masters. That is the reality of the world in which we live. And the arms trade is right at the center point of how neoliberal capitalism converts public money, tax revenue, into private profits. And that's why our defense budgets, as Rania outlined, continue to increase, because if they don't, you don't have the capacity to continue to pay these bribes in ever larger numbers and to oil the wheels of our political system. Let me conclude these first remarks, and I will touch on how we deal with this when we discuss solutions. But let me conclude my opening remarks by saying the situation in Palestine is based on a similar settler colonialism, European settler colonialism, to the system of apartheid in South Africa. And both Nelson Mandela and Archbishop Desmond Tutu described the apartheid that Israel imposes as even worse than we experienced in South Africa. And it is based on the same racist white supremacy that dominates our politics globally today. But before we become too disheartened and too depressed, let us remind ourselves that my former boss, Nelson Mandela, on his release from 27 years in an apartheid prison, didn't come out and say, "I'm free, let's party." Instead, he said, "Our freedom is incomplete without the freedom of the Palestinian people." Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. I'll call for a pause and a reflection of your input that you've just made. And again, ask people if they would like to share the reflections in the chat box. They're welcome to do so. You know, you spoke about the best democracies money can buy, Andrew. I think that was Michael Moore. I think it was in 2014 or 2015, he wrote about, and this was about the American system. And a lot of us that follow global politics and have a worldview understand the relationship between money, political parties, and ultimately the influence that they have on elections. But I think what's happening now is that those who benefit from the system have become brazen. And what I was proposing, that Michael Moore make a sequel to that. And the sequel is entitled The Worst Democracies Money Can Buy. I don't know if that makes sense to you, because what's happening, that in this idea of democracy, as we spoke about, that governments themselves have become institutions where violence is institutionalized, conflict is institutionalized, and at best, it is governments for the few and not the many. And this is generally the problem that we're experiencing across the world, including in a young democracy as ours. What I'd like to, if we can, just see if there's any questions that we have for the panelists at this stage. Please indicate. I cannot fully follow the system, but I would just like, whilst we're waiting for that, I just wanted to just check. We're also trying to develop a kind of camaraderie between and amongst our panelists, right? So, you know, in the way that you spoke, each of you spoke with your own preparations, uncaucused from each other. I would like, Rania, you know, to offer you the opportunity of just reflecting on what you've heard from Philippe and Andrew. And then once you've done, I'd like to ask if Philippe would like to do a similar reflection, and Andrew also, to give you the opportunity just for a couple of minutes and so on, whilst you know, the rest of us are digesting you know, or the points that you've made. So Rania, over to you. If you would like to take up the offer, you're most welcome to.
Well, I'm truly honored to have met Philippe and Andrew through this webinar. I felt overwhelmed listening to both Philippe and Andrew, and I caught myself saying, or I caught myself feeling, wow, the horror is so large, and the monster is so big, and where do we go, and how do we stop it? And as an organizer and an activist, and as also somebody who, you know, and I continue to go back to this as somebody whose community has been butchered since the 1930s, on and on and on, and every year becomes worse than the year before. We do not have the privilege of pessimism. I remember Eduardo Galeano's words, let's save pessimism for better times. We do not have that privilege of pessimism. So how, amidst the very clear and intense presentation that Philippe and Andrew gave to us, how do we look at all that and look at that monster of the weapons industry, look at the monster of capitalism and imperialism, and refuse despair and despondency and say, okay, this is how we're going to fight it. And this is how we're going to fight it, not so that we feel good about ourselves at the end of the day by saying, I go to a protest, I go to a rally, I write a few letters to congressional representatives, I pat myself on the back and say I tried. No, but how do we fight it truly strategically in the way that our resistance fighters, who, as we say in Arabic, I bow down and kiss the soles of their feet, as our resistance fighters build a strategy of liberation. How do we build that strategy of liberation? I don't have an answer, but I think it's critical to be difficult with ourselves and ask ourselves, how do we do this? Because we not only need to defeat the war machine, we need to defeat capitalism, because they are married to each other. So how do we defeat capitalism at the stage that we're in, when we just have pockets of socialism around the world, you know, with the glorious Cuba, but where else? And it's a serious question that I would like to pose to Philippe and Andrew. Given the horrors that you presented, the privatization of weapons and the privatization of security, primarily so they can be unaccountable and they can skirt the law. Of course, the military already skirts the law, and the immense corruption of the weapons industry amidst those two horrors that you presented. How do we fight them?
Excellent. I think that poses the challenge. We don't have the luxury of being pessimistic. I like, instead of intellectual pessimism, I like activist optimism. Yeah. That's the thing, even yeah, in our own struggle, the apartheid machinery was omnipowerful, omnipresent. They were everywhere. They were even in your own family, guarding the system. So yeah, but that didn't stop us. So I think you asked for your fellow panelists to sort of reflect on these the kind of the horrors, if you like, that we are exposed to, and perhaps I want to offer Philippe the opportunity of coming in. Philippe, yeah, how do you see us taking on this monster
Mm.
that you have just described?
Yes. Yeah, thank you very much. And just when you were also posing this question, also I was reflecting on one opportunity I had to discuss with some colleagues from Palestine about a very interesting concept that brings us to a very important dimension. I think that in order to deal with this monster, as you mentioned, Gino, I think two approaches. I think we have, of course, one strategical approach, which will combine, you know, legal, civil disobedience, political actions in the street in a massive way. So this can bring us to, to the politics of nonviolence, how we can use these politics, to confront these pillars of power or this big monster we are mentioning. But at the second level, and I think that for me is also interesting to also to see the example of Palestine, is the concept of sumut. So sumut, which is the concept of the everyday resistance, and is a very, very, traditional old concept that it explains, the everyday resistance of the Palestinians, you know, um, from the behavior, the attitudes, these low politics you saw in the communities, like when young people are crossing checkpoints, how they are looking to the eyes of the settlers, how when people are harvesting the olive trees, even though that they are close to a illegal settlement, that they can shoot them and kill them. These resistance. Or when we saw the images of how Palestinians in Gaza were moving to the north despite the massive destruction. So this is something like this phenomenon is something like requires to understand the importance of the mentality of nonviolence, the mentality of resistance. And I think that if we combine this mentality of resistance, the sumut, which also includes the respect and the connection with the land, the respect and the connection with the olive trees, which is completely opposite to the capitalism, approach of destruction and, plundering of natural resources, without limits. Palestinians are taking care of the land. That are creating a new paradigm, and this paradigm is rooted in this concept of sumut, mentality of resistance at the infra-politics level, at the lower level of politics in the communities, but also connecting with strategical action. And maybe we can go deeper on this part later on.
Yeah, I think we're weaving the thread. There's a wonderful tapestry that's being woven right here. I can feel it. I can see it. Thank you, Philippe. Andrew, any thoughts from your side on this
Yeah,
particular discussion?
yeah, I really like this concept of sumud. I think we're in a moment where our political systems are failing, even where we're lucky enough to live in so-called liberal democracies where they're nothing of the sort. In Britain today, they're using anti-terror legislation against climate activists and against activists who oppose genocide. Now, maybe I've been very badly educated in South Africa, but I would suggest that actual terrorism is weaponizing and supporting a genocide rather than opposing it. But this is the state of the world, the madness of the moment that we find ourselves in. So how do we address it? I mean, I think the concept of samud is a very important one. I think that our traditional methods of activism, protest, etc., are not unimportant. You know, the fact that every second or third week, hundreds of thousands of people turn out on the streets of a city like London, in places like Germany, where they're beating up Jews who are critical of Israel. You know, you'd think a country that had committed at least 2 genocides and was now enabling and facilitating the third would have a little bit more self-awareness than what we're seeing in the psychosis that has taken over Germany. But I think I agree entirely with Philippe that in everything we do, we need to be taking on the established order, this power. I think it's the responsibility of each one of us to speak truth to power. But at the same time, you know, in the 23 years that I've been working on the arms trade, I've never seen anything as impressive, as impactful as the direct action that is carried out by Palestine Action in Britain and in other parts of Europe, where at threats to their own liberty, and many of them are sitting in jail serving sentences now, they simply take over weapons factories, mainly belonging to Elbit Systems, the Israeli weapons maker, and they destroy the machinery. Now, what they have done is they've prevented some weapons from being exported to Israel. Second, they have caused Elbit Systems to lose a contract worth over £280 million with the British government because they destroyed the weaponry that was supposed to be delivered to the Ministry of Defense a few weeks later. Now, this is having an impact, and that's why the governments are using anti-terror legislation to try and protect this edifice that the three of us have outlined. But I would say there's someone else we need to learn from, and that is people who've actually experienced directly the horrors of war as combatants. If you look at a lot of US war veterans, they many years ago started a campaign of refusing to pay 30% of the tax that they owe tax authorities. Why? Because there's what they describe as the Lockheed tax. 30 cents in every dollar that is paid to US tax authorities goes to Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, Boeing, et cetera, all of the defense contractors. And they refuse to pay that. And the American authorities don't know what to do with them. Because if they make an issue of it and start sending them to jail, they're going to get far more publicity for what they're doing, and far more people will start doing the same thing. I think these are the sorts of tactics that we need to be using. And then I think solidarity with marginalized and oppressed communities. You know, I think back to those incredibly brave young people who went to Palestine and stood in the way of bulldozers which were demolishing Palestinian homes, one of whom was murdered by the Israelis. A British photojournalist who went over and was documenting the experience of Palestinian oppression and was shot dead by an Israeli sniper. It is these sorts of actions. I think the world is in such a dire state that we have to continue doing what we're doing, but we need to move it to next levels. The actual technical solutions to these problems are very simple. And we've outlined to the United Nations, amongst others, how easy it would actually be to enforce arms control legislation if they actually had any political will to do so. How easy it would be to massively cut the corruption in the global arms trade if the World Trade Organization and our political leaders were actually willing to do that. The problem is the lack of political will. So we have to take the fight to our corrupt, mendacious, bought political leaders. And if when it comes to elections, there are no candidates who stand for the things that we believe in, we should stand ourselves. I stood against Keir Starmer in my own local area, the Prime Minister of Britain, and we halved his vote. And this was in an election that had seen the lowest voter turnout since universal suffrage was introduced in the United Kingdom. So what we're doing in the UK is we're building from the grassroots up a mass movement, not only to oppose the way in which state power is exercised now, but to actually compete for state power, to be able to change the nature, functioning, and most important, the structures of the corrupt state power that we are all the victims of.
If I could add to what you so powerfully presented, Andrew, I agree with everything that you stated, with one small exception. I think speaking truth to power doesn't get us much. I think we need to develop our power, because the powerful know the truth and they don't give a damn. So how do we build our power? And all the things that you outlined are that building of power. There's one thing that's missing, which is unions. Labor force, once they are unionized, have a lot of power. We know from the longshoremen on the west coast of the United States who refused to take the weapons from the ships. There is such power in unions that there are so many laws in the United States that prohibit workers from acting in solidarity with each other. It's illegal, you know, which says a lot about how powerful unions could be. And I think we need to go back to that. And I would just add one more thing to all that you presented, which is brilliant. In addition to all of it, can we create space for thinking about what we want? When I was in South Africa, more than 10 years ago, I was asked, when I was doing a BDS tour, I was asked by some comrades, have I thought about what kind of Palestine will we have once it is liberated? And I told them, let it be liberated and then we'll think. And they said, no, 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 do not do the mistake that we did in South Africa. Plan the liberation of Palestine from now. Think about the economic and the agricultural and the political model that you want to have from now. And I throw that in here not only because, you know, yes, let's plan it, but also because the moment we start planning a liberation and we start envisioning what that liberation looks like, there becomes a space in our lungs and we become more able to breathe. And so to create that space in our day-to-day actions where we say, okay, we have liberated our lands. Now, how do we want to have it? You know, what kind of system do we want? And so that becomes our way to maintain our sumud, to maintain our resilience, is by envisioning the liberation that we dream of.
That is an excellent point. I'll come to you now, Andrew. That's an excellent point. And that is, whilst we're fighting against something, we also are able to articulate what we're fighting for, right? That's an important part of it. And I wanted to pick up, and that is, and this is not just for the analysis now, for us to reflect on even beyond this webinar, that we spoke about the monster, and if we are looking at the worldview, we understand that our democracies that many many of us fought for is being captured, right? And the point that was made is that we're in this moment, right? And I think, us as activists, part of what we need to do is to try and reflect on the moment we are in. I just wanted to sort of, I like Howard Zinn. And one of the reasons why I like Howard Zinn is because he was a union organizer on the docks in New York, right? And of course, through his work and his activism and so on, I mean, he incurred the wrath, right, if you like, of the American state. What he says, and this is just something that I want to throw into what we were speaking about around the issue of solutions, questions of civil disobedience, resistance, and so on. He says, historically, the most terrible things, war, genocide, and slavery, have resulted not from disobedience, but from obedience. So I think it's, and I say to young sort of activists and so on that part of what we do and our disposition is to be disobedient to capitalism and to global capitalism in particular. So I'd like us to reflect on that, but also thinking about as part of the resistance to and envisioning a kind of future, whether it's of Palestine or any other part, or even Ukraine, Philippe. Let's see how we can, in a sense, move the next half an hour, at least, or 20 minutes, the discussion into what we were talking about. How do we fight back? And how do we fight smart, given all the tools that we have at our disposal? And what we understand, and that is social change does not come about from waiting for the weaknesses of the strong, but by harnessing the strengths of the weak. And I want to leave that not just to the panelists, but also to members of the audience, the participants, to see how is it within our means for us to be able to create the basis for the broadest possible unity against the warmongers in our world, and in a sense reinforce the peace builders amongst us? And there are billions of us. There are few, we are many, right? Is there anything, Joseph, from the chat box that you would like to raise with us at the moment? There's some wonderful comments, and thank you all for posting some of these resources into the chat box. But perhaps, we want to reflect on sort of, this kind of, if you were the Secretary General of the United Nations, what would you do? Have you ever thought about that, Rania? Okay, then tell us.
I have thought about that all the time. If I were, what would I do? I mean, if it is within my power, which is the big caveat, I would dismantle the Security Council because it is the epitome of the lack of democracy. I would dismantle the Security Council, just give power to the General Assembly. Now, that's not the prerogative of the Secretary General of the United Nations. But, I also don't mind applying dictatorship principles to build a democracy. And so removing the Security Council becomes one step towards actually having a functioning United Nations. And maybe that is the silver lining of having Trump as the president of the United States, because he is so gloriously anti anything that is rational that he unveils the horror of US imperialism. He makes our struggle against him all the easier, while President Obama, with his eloquence, made it so much harder. Even though Obama was the deportation president, Obama was the drone killer, Obama was the horror, but he presented it with this eloquence that it was hard to get people to rally against him. So sorry for that digression, but that is what I would do, is see how we can dismantle the Security Council, dismantle it completely, And also, I would love for us to reevaluate what we mean by democracy, because I hear that word thrown a lot, and it's not a word that I'm a fan of. Just like the word peace is not a word that I'm a fan of. I think both these words, for me particularly, have lost their meaning. What is democracy if the public is uninformed? Then we have a mass of people who have a narrative that is created voting. I don't want them voting if they're not informed. So then how do we have a democratic system with an informed public, which means how do we create a mainstream media that is free from corporate influence? How do we create that? How do we build that? How do we create schools that are logical instead of schools that teach obedience for our students? The model of schools in the United States is very similar to the model of prisons, by the way, the physical construct of the school. And in the United States, let us remember, the Democratic and Republican Party are private companies. They're private. They operate by their own laws. So that's why we had somebody running for the Democratic presidency, Kamala Harris, who had not won a single election. So there's this facade of democracy that is presented that I want to push against. If the public is not given adequate information, and if the public is not given adequate choices, then let us not call it a democracy. And I would say the same with peace, because, we've had peace shoved down our throats. But if I do not have economic security, and to me, economic security has higher precedence than anything else. If I do not have the security of having a home and having a roof over my head and having healthcare that is worthy and dignified, and having clean water and having clean electricity, then how can I call it peace? How can it be peace? So let's push back against those terms and reevaluate even what we mean by violence. Because to me, capitalism is violent. So those of us that pick up arms, which I would love to do, but I cannot, I don't have the skills to do that. But those who have picked up arms against capitalism, are they violent? Or are they resisting the violence of the system itself? And given the narratives that we live under today, and given how small the space is for us in the United States and in Western Europe to even say what we want, then what do? Do we reorient our words so they become legal and we do not get fined and we do not get imprisoned? Or do we push back and say, no, I do want to say that I support armed resistance against occupation. I do want to continue to say it. And if they do want to come and imprison me for saying it, okay, imprison me for saying it. But this becomes a strategy that we need to acknowledge, and need to also acknowledge the United States in so many ways, is a member of the global South and not a member of the global North. It is horrifically unequal. And the poverty in the United States that we have witnessed is equal in some extents to the poverty, the enforced poverty that we have seen in refugee camps in Lebanon. And if we can just think about that.
No, absolutely. Thank you, Rania. I mean, for the fire, that is, and I think that's so important, and that is, including the fact that the idea that somebody says is that all of those decrees that were planned before the inauguration of Trump were planned so that they could overwhelm us by all of these things, and then they create mayhem and chaos. So these guys are kings of chaos. We are the kings of order and peace, if I should say so. Things must work in harmony. Philippe, do you want to come in? There's a question on the chat box. I would like you to draw it, but Philippe, I'm happy if you just want to sort of complete this particular round before we move
Yes.
into sort of the final bits, right?
Okay.
Yeah, please come in.
Yeah, some more ideas also, because I mean, very interesting discussion. I completely agree with the idea of building and using power, and this relation with trade unions and creating networks, and using strategically this power, in different spheres. Should be in parallel with what the concept constructive program that Gandhi was promoting, and I saw also in the chat was, I mean, to creating the future of tomorrow, the vision of tomorrow. But also, I would like to bring these two more ideas. One is that also they create spaces for co-creating this future. It's very interesting, the case study of Poland in the 80s, Solidarność, in a system, in a regime of fear, repression. Solidarność was able to create spaces between workers, between different professional areas, to spaces of trust and security to discuss the future. Creating spaces, security spaces today is very important, considering mass surveillance, considering cyber espionage of the different movements around Middle East, North Africa, and you know how this is evolving. So we need to create digital and offline spaces for creating and strategizing this change. And another key idea is that also the creation of civilian-based defense systems. Andrew was mentioning the system is corrupted. Our leaders represent the billionaires, the multinational corporations. So we see this aggression from these actors, not only in our conflicts, but also in our society. So if we dare, to speak out, we are repressed, we are brought to prison, we are repressed in different ways. So we need to create systems of disobedience. And I think the case of Ukraine is very interesting and can bring some, insights for this discussion. So Ukrainian people were able, through decentralized networks of power based on trust at local level, were able to confront occupation in Kherson, Zaporizhia, in Donetsk and Luhansk. They disobey, the pseudo referendums by, for example, disobeying to share the census with the occupiers. They create actions to physical interposition to military convoys. They create systems of information between people, okay, in order to identify saboteurs in different communities. They also transform conflicts, inside families, inside the communities, in order to reinforce social cohesion, which was one of the key targets of the war of information of Russia. It was to polarize society. So social cohesion and resilience, community resilience, is very important against this aggression. We can think in the conflict areas, but also think today how fear is injected, how distrust is injected in our society. So building resilience and social cohesion is the pillar in order to be able to resist and to exert our power to transform the situation. The role of young people, to bring solidarity actions, to support the vulnerable groups. The role of women in terms of protection of civilians was essential in Ukraine. So communication, strategy, humor, so our tools, non-violent tools that we can use to build this power. So I bring these ideas also for the discussion. So
Gino, you're muted.
Sorry. I think Daria mutes me because there's an echo in this room. It's going back to your echo chamber. So, Andrew, do you want to just sort of complete this round of
Sure.
sort of contributions, please? And then I want to open it up to the chat box. Yeah.
So many important things have been said. I just want to add a few things. I mean, one of the things that capitalism, especially late capitalism that we're experiencing, does, and Eduardo Galeano, who Rania mentioned, writes about this extensively. We've used Galeano's words throughout the Shadow World film because he gives voice to another world, to another way of seeing things. And one of the things he says is that capitalism has intentionally taken away our creativity, our ability to imagine a different future. I would strongly recommend his brilliant book, Children of the Days, which I regard as a seminal text that I keep with me all the time. I find it inspiring, I find it informative, and just very, very important. We live in an age of technology. At the moment, that technology is controlled by a very small group of people who use it to profit as much as they can and to fight wars in ever more terrifying ways. We need to use that technology to create real democracy in the world. Why do we need liberal representative democracy? Why do we need these intermediaries who represent only their own interests and the interests of those people who fund them? They do nothing for us. I mean, politicians of today are characterized not only by their extraordinary mediocrity, their extreme mendacity, but also by their overwhelming fear to actually have contact with ordinary people who they're supposed to be representing. Let me take that a bit further. So I think we have an enormous challenge to rethink the world. Karl Popper described paradigms as being political and economic systems. And he described when one paradigm is no longer working, but we don't yet know what the next paradigm is going to look like. We're in an interregnum, and we're in a classic interregnum in the world at the moment. And we have to use our creativity and our imagination to create the next paradigm, to create the next reality, a system that serves the many, not the few. That's the first thing. The second thing is I completely agree with the statement about unions, except that in a lot of countries, and in the UK where I'm based, unions have been neutered from playing any sort of political role. So the biggest trade unions in the United Kingdom, rather than like in the 1970s when their workers were refusing to build jets for Pinochet's regime in Chile, the leaders of trade unions now meet with the government every week so they can pat each other on the back as to how they're controlling the political system. So unions need to go back to what they're supposed to be in some countries, which is actually representing the interests of workers, but with an internationalist perspective, not only in the context of their immediate industry and country. And of course, and we've all implied this, the media. How do we speak truth to power when in most of the world's media, we receive exactly the opposite of truth? Because let's look at ownership patterns, and you don't need to be a conspiracist to realize that BlackRock, Fidelity, State Street are the main investors in all of the world's fossil fuel companies, in all of the world's main banks, in all of the world's main defense companies, and, shock, horror, and surprise, in all of the world's biggest media companies. This hasn't happened by accident, the situation we found ourselves in. It has been engineered, and we have to re-engineer it in the interests of the majority of people. And I agree with Rania entirely. Having people like Trump and Netanyahu in power gives us the unvarnished reality of, and excuse my language, the shit show that the world is today. And it's better that way Because then a lot of people who've never really thought about these issues start thinking, wow, is this the best we can do? Because that's what it is. Whereas the Obamas, what do they call him? The Benetton candidate. You know, they're great at PR. They present this veneer while doing as much evil beneath that veneer. We're lucky in the United Kingdom in that our Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, is incapable of actually ingratiating himself to anyone but his billionaire donors. Every time he opens his mouth, we know he's lying, and he alienates yet more people. So he, again, is the perfect type of politician to have because he's incapable of doing the PR, because he thinks that the majority of people simply don't matter. Now, I wanted to conclude this by just saying, in this reimagining, the work of Eduardo Galeano is incredibly important, and any of you who haven't read him, I would strongly, strongly recommend you to. In addition to which, if you want practical suggestions about how to deal with the global arms trade from a variety of perspectives, Palestine Action, Palestinian activists on the ground, our new book is not only how the global arms trade is ruining the world, it's what we can do about it. And there are brilliant chapters from activists around the world as to what they've done to take forward their anti-militarist struggles in their localities. But then thinking about the bigger picture, David Graeber's work, who so sadly passed away just a couple of years ago, a brilliant, brilliant thinker who was involved in struggles on the ground, and that informed his theoretical work. And really, I would recommend any of his work. Is just brilliant. I'm also reading a new biography of Frantz Fanon at the moment by Adam Schatz, which I've just come across. And, you know, I'd always, growing up in Africa, involved in the struggle for liberation in South Africa, of course, you've heard of Frantz Fanon, but I don't think I ever understood how seminal and important a thinker he is for our situation today, because he talks about not only the material aspects of competing political powers, he talks about the psychological as well in ways that are incredibly important. And finally, I want to recommend a novel to people. Brilliant, brilliant Portuguese writer who died at almost 100 years of age a few years ago, José Saramago, who wrote a book called Seeing. And the book is about the city, obviously Lisbon, but he doesn't call it that, in which the military junta call an election, and 83% of the population leave their ballots blank. And the junta doesn't know how to deal with it. So they just start arresting and repressing people. And then after a few months of that, they call another election, and 95% of people leave their ballots blank. And they think there must be some sort of organized resistance to them, but there's not. It's just people taking control of their own lives and their own world in which they live. And these are the stories we need to be reading, because we mustn't look for leaders. If we want leaders, look in a mirror, because it's up to each and every one of us. And this, you know, I see it in South Africa every day when I'm there. We've had only a partial liberation. There's much more to do in South Africa. But in South Africa, there are 17 to 18 social protests every single day, often in remote rural areas against local corruption, local lack of service delivery. People will not just say, yeah, well, this is the way of the world, what can we do? And we need to learn from that. And we shouldn't forget that South Africa, through the will of millions of ordinary South Africans who sacrificed an enormous amount through waves of strikes, through ungovernability, with the support of tens of millions of people around the world who imposed BDS on South Africa, that started to affect the economy in ways that affected the quality of life of white South Africans. We won liberation, at least from the horrors of overt racism.
Mhm. Thank you for that, Andrew. I just want to pick up. There's a wonderful set of contributions in the chat box, right? And I think on the first issue of the unions, I don't think any one of us are suggesting that, okay, we agree that the unions have been weakened. I think from my perspective, I think the unions are fighting a rearguard sort of battle for survival of their members, because there's other attacks, economic warfare being waged against workers of the world. But I do think, and I would try and get a sense that part of what we need to do is to engage that movement at various levels, both at the international level, at the national level, at the continental level. So that's and I see that as sort of building the allies, the alliances. And, you know, the thing about it is in many countries, unions and social movements outside see themselves as part and parcel of the same struggle. The struggle on the factory, the struggle in the community is one and the same. In many parts of the world, they have sort of they've segmented it, they've separated it, and yeah. So that's, I think, you know, sort of those who are interested in peace, in forging the greatest possible unity, must be speaking to organized labor in that way. That's the first part, right? And I don't think you will disagree. I don't want to open up a debate on that, but they are a critical ally, and we must engage them. The second one is around USAID, right? And I think, Rania, you want to come in there. I'll give you the opportunity of coming in on that particular issue. Then the third part that was raised is around the control of the media, right? And Soren in the chat box spoke about the fact that our heavy reliance on the 4 tech giants also renders us culpable, if you like, of participating in the system. And the question there was, how can we have a decentralized peace movement, if you like, solidarity movement that is not overtly dependent on the media? And Andrew, as you know, you control the media, you control the narrative, you control the narrative, you control the story, you control the story, you control the power, and you crowd out everyone else. So those are the sort of I think on the unions, maybe we can find another way in the next webinar of how to build those kinds of alliances, unions and other organizations. But I want to come back. We've got just a few minutes left. I have the prerogative, and I must just say, of the participants and the panelists, they've given me the prerogative, the webinar team, to extend it, right, depending on the heat of the moment, if you like. So we will take a few minutes extra. I hope you can stay with us as the panelists. So can I then hone in on, so the first one, Rani, I want to hold on the USAID thing. I want to focus on how to create decentralized movements that are not dependent on the tech giants for their legitimacy, for their communications. Is that a possibility? Anyone would like to take that? Or anyone, even from in the audience, right? If you want to answer that, please, you can absolutely raise your hand, because I think that's the centrality. When we speak about boycotts and BDS, when I see, you know, how dependent we are on Microsoft and what Microsoft is doing, you know, with the Zionist regime, it is, I say, well, you know, where do I go? You know, anyway, so I'll leave that open. How can we how can we create a decentralized solidarity movement that can take on these giants? Anyone?
Yeah, you know, if I could very briefly respond to that, as well as go back and answer the USAID question that was posed in the Q&A. One of the good things that has happened with the monopolization of mainstream media is very few people read newspapers anymore. I think other than us, nobody reads them. So they can spout their lies, but they don't get that much audience. Same with the news. Nobody watches TV anymore. So then that leaves the social media, and that is why the United States has been cracking down on TikTok, because TikTok was a way for people to see the truth. And I think I have a lot of hope in the Chinese and with the software that the Chinese are introducing into the world. So there will always be this other avenue for us to be using. And I think we need to be very careful also in what kind of you know, communication services we use. But I do want to go back to the USAID question, because I think it's critical. So the question that was posed on you know, on the Q&A was that in Trump's mayhem, is there any cracks we can use? Example, the complete shutdown of USAID. No question, this will paralyze a lot of the infrastructure we as global activists are using for a cause. When I was in Lebanon, when I lived there for 19 years, we specifically refused to take money from USAID. It was a clear rejection, and you could tell which organizations were taking money from USAID and which organizations refused to do so. I think one of the best things that has happened is the closure of USAID, because USAID is an imperial instrument of the US government. And they cloak themselves in funding certain aspects, but it is an imperial instrument. In Lebanon, if we were to take money from USAID, then USAID would dictate to us whom we could work with. And they specifically would prohibit us from working with anyone who they deem to be a member of Hezbollah, which is ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous. And then we would have to hand over a lot of information to them. So basically, we would serve as espionage instruments to them, and we would serve as instruments of division within our own country. So I thought it was fantastic. And the joke in Lebanon now is that all these NGOs and certain universities who have gotten funding from USAID will now let them disintegrate. It's good. And I say it's good because Lebanon also has the highest percentage of NGOs per capita. And when you look at non-governmental organizations in a country, if there are a lot of them, that means the state is failing in providing the services and the rights to its populace. Because why should there be an organization to provide water and security? Those are the responsibilities of the state. And with regards to unions, I would just encourage people to reevaluate the question. The question isn't if unions can do this. The question is, how can unions do this? In the United States, we have seen small unions. So there's a national union called UE 150. In the local UE 150s, the local small ones, they have passed brilliant resolutions, and it works its way up. Let us not forget that we had a major union in the United States call for a ceasefire, and then they backtracked and endorsed Biden. But we have these elements. So the question is, how can we get unions to be politicized again? And how can we, as non-workers, people who are not in a union, actually stand in solidarity with union workers? Which means before I go to them and ask them to stand with me against the weapons industry, I need to stand with them in their struggle for unionization. And once I stand with them in their struggle for unionization, such as here in North Carolina, there's a struggle to unionize Amazon workers because of the horrors that Amazon workers do. So once I'm standing with them and once I'm able to get them unionized and support them, then we have that conversation. So how do we build solidarity with union workers? And I would just encourage us to just transform those questions in our mind from if we can do this to how we can do this.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that is very well said. That is very well said. And I think also that in looking at the impact of these measures, if you like, I was saying to fellow comrades that it will serve, us well if we start building connections with the trade unions in America who are feeling the effects of these sort of draconian measures. Philippe, I wanted to just check with you on the issue of a decentralized movement of solidarity that is not tech dependent, and your ideas around civil disobedience. Any thoughts you'd like to share on that,
Yes.
Philippe?
No, yes, I would like to go, to answer this question and also to build on the importance of Rani. I was mentioning that I think that it's super important to establish this alliance because it's really important on the civil disobedience also to disrupt supply chains. We need to hack the system. And this means also to be able to disrupt the hubs of the supply chains, like, for example, ports, the Amazon storage. This is essential, can make an important damage and will give us leverage, political leverage, to impose our agendas as well. But connected with the decentralized movements, I think that there are two perspectives here. I think that decentralized movements are based on the component of the issue of trust at local level, the connections between people at local level, even in situations like, for example, Western Sahara in the worst times of the occupation, or Belarus today. So you still have, groups of 50, 100 people in the neighborhoods that they are gathering and discussing and resisting. And this is an invisible resistance, which is very important, these physical contacts, for co-creating, the future. But this is connected also with the idea of today we are facing not only national problems, but also transnational, phenomena, transnational challenges. So we need to build decentralized, but also global, movements. And I think here technopolitics bring us very interesting approaches. So at the end of the day, technopolitics is the intersection between technology and politics. And it's about how we are using the digital infrastructures. When we talk about the cloud, when we talk about using X, when we talk about using TikTok or YouTube, we are already, practicing democracy. So we need, to disobey this infrastructure. We need to create our own infrastructure, open source infrastructure. You cannot imagine, how many hacker activists are around the globe creating these new infrastructures. I invite you also to see the film, The Internet, so The Son of Internet. It's a very interesting film which explains it's like the story of a young student from the MIT who were disobeying, the MIT, who was privatizing the knowledge. So technopolitics, building our own open source infrastructure where we can use our own governance, because we need to self-govern. So in order to disobey, we need to disobey from the current systems and self-govern ourselves. And the digital environment gives us a very good opportunity, as Andrew was mentioning. So digital organizing, something that Angela Davis, Naomi Klein was mentioning during the pandemics. Digital organizing, where we can strategize, creating new narrative, connecting with our comrades from India, connecting with our comrades from Ecuador, where we can, deal with these global challenges. I think this is something that is a must, in my opinion. Yeah.
Before I speak, I must unmute myself. So we've just got a few minutes left, right? Okay. Firstly, let me just say, and Andrew, I would like maybe you to, if you want to come in, or do you feel that we've completed this round of discussions, right? But let me first say, I want to thank on the chat box, let me thank David, Sandeep, Soren, Phil, Matti, for all your contributions, right? And let's say that the issues that are raised in the chat box, that the team is recording them, we are collecting them, and all of these things, these ideas, and views and insights will get fed into the overall report of the webinar, right? So I want to thank you for your contributions and your suggestions. And also, you would have noticed every time you spoke, both Rani and Daria were busy posting the kind of links. So I mean, that is so it's brilliant, but it's difficult to keep up with. So even there will be a recording of all the relevant resources all of you have posted onto for the purposes of this discussions, right? So let me just check. Can I ask any famous last words? I'll start off with you, Andrew, and then we go, Philippe. We go in alphabetical order this time, right? And I'll be last. Okay, over to you, Andrew. Famous last word. Come on.
First of all, just a huge thank you to the organizers, to the brilliant fellow panelists, and to you, Gino, for managing this conversation so well. I just want to add one little thing to what I think has been a really important and inspiring conversation from what Rania and Philippe were saying in this last section. I'm in total agreement with all of the things that you've set out. I want to add one addition to it. And I agree with the way in which we need to organize digitally. We need to organize locally, and we need to organize globally in intersected ways. There's one thing we shouldn't forget, and that is the power of just talking to each other. At the moment in the United Kingdom, we have this menace of Nigel Farage, who's like the British version of Trump. So politely offensive rather than impolitely offensive. This guy was an investment banker. The day after the Brexit vote that he was very central in ensuring, he was stood outside the German embassy waiting to get his German passport so that it didn't affect him in any way. And a lot of people in this country see him as a part of the solution. So in addition to organizing locally in our own areas, we need to go out to these other areas and we need to explain to people how people like Nigel Farage, Donald Trump, etc., Elon Musk, are an absolutely central part of the problem and in no ways any part of the solution, because the right has been very good at exploiting digital mobilization and organizing. And on its terrain that it likes, the culture wars, where it says the most spurious things that then gets a whole lot of support from people who haven't thought that deeply about these things. And part of our responsibility as activists, but as human beings first and foremost, is to go and talk with these very people. It reminds me, Gino, of having to go to areas in South Africa in the lead up to the 94 elections and talk to communities who thought that Mandela was some sort of communist ogre who was going to take away their houses, their cars, their swimming pools, rape their daughters, and then drive them into the sea. And look at the perception of Mandela today. And that work of being on doorsteps, of talking to other human beings about the reality of the world we live in, is also very important alongside digital organizing and all of these other things. It all seems huge. It all seems massive. The power that stands in front of us seems insurmountable. It's nothing of the sort. Again, and this will be my final word, and I'm sorry that I'm again quoting our fellow country person, Nelson Mandela, who said very simply, it always seems impossible until it's done.
Phil, I'm noting your questions. I want to find a way of rounding up with Phil's questions, but Philip, over to you, and then to Rania for the final sort of closing arguments, if you like. Thank you, Philip.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I find a thought. I will ask also, it came also many, nice sentences and also reflections, from Gandhi or Henry Thoreau, which was one of the famous, writer and philosopher from US who provoked disobedience to capitalism in the in 19th century. And he was, both they were saying that when the system, when the aggressor is harming your soul and your consciousness, you have the responsibility to disobey. And I think that in this context of lies, distrust, disinformation, we need to start from ourselves. We need to look about our own truth, our own consciousness, to have the power, the leverage to build power from the community and to change the context. So I think for me, I think this is something like important, and also going to with the Andrew was mentioned Galeano, and I think that the Galeano was saying ve con confianza en dirección a tus sueños, so go confidently, with confidence in the direction of your dreams, and build towards your own horizon. So I think that we have the values, we have our soul and consciousness, and we have the strategies. We just need to combine values and campaigns in this direction. So let's keep it there.
Thank you again
Yes.
thank you again to the organizers and the attendees, and thank you for introducing me to these panelists. I'm truly honored to share this space with you. I think what we also need is to create a story that is important for people that they can see, because as of yet, they can't visualize liberation. They can't visualize socialism, which is what I believe in. They can't visualize it, but they can visualize the right, so to speak. So how do we get our story to be powerful? And my second thought is we fundamentally have to believe that liberation is possible. Secretary General of Hezbollah, Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah, said that Israel is, I still can't believe that we lost him, that Israel is weaker than the spider's web. And if we believe that, if we hold on to the many stories in our history that have showed us the power of people, if we just very recently in Lebanon, when, there were people themselves who went to the south and liberated the lands directly with their bodies, standing in front of Israeli tanks with their arms extended. We saw that again in Gaza, and we have so many stories of this, of the strength of the people. So I think it's fundamental that we believe that liberation is possible and hold on to that belief and organize accordingly. And I want to end with a quote from one of our most esteemed authors and political activist, Ghassan Kanafani, who wrote, "It is not enough to hate and believe in the past to make a revolution. Hatred and belief in the past are sufficient prods for the rebellion phase. We must love and be future-oriented if we wish to carry out the revolution." He also said that the liberation is as long as the revolution itself. When we ask, when will we be liberated? It's as long as the revolution. So let's hold on to those beliefs and hold on to that struggle.
I was using the unmute or the mute button to just pause there. And I think all of those beautiful closing arguments really are deeply inspirational, deeply powerful, and extremely positive. From my side, so let me do my sort of roundup as such. This will just take a minute or so. I think insofar as the key issues that we've put in the chat box, I think we've already started producing a little summary of that. And certainly we'd like to feed it back to you, right? On the question of unions, even on the question of civil disobedience and where people make gains and advance particular struggles, there's always the tendency for the enemy, if you like, to roll back those particular struggles. And I think we must think about how it was also an issue that was raised in the previous seminar, that in moving forward, in counting our victories as we are moving forward, how do we not lapse into old ways of thinking, right? So it's a dialectic, it's an ongoing struggle, and it's never complete, you know. The liberation is as long as the revolution, comrades. On the issue of building alliances, we've identified the unions as one critical target and certainly an important target in the disruption of supply chains. And Philippe, you should know that there was a ship with Israeli weapons loaded in Vietnam that was trying to round off Cape Town. And they got blocked in South Africa and they got blocked in Namibia and eventually landed in Albania. So, you know, and this is not just the unions, but this is sort of you know, civil society organizations and unions working in collaboration with sympathetic governments that refuse the right of entry to ports and so on. So that's the kind of alliances, you know, that we could, you know, build, right? So finally, I think that insofar as you know, what's left for me is to say thank you so much. Really, this has been such a wonderful discussion. I think the webinar team will be pleasantly surprised that we took this particular webinar almost 20 minutes into extra time. You know, when we were thinking about the 90 minutes of football, we are in injury time now. So really thank you. Thank the participants. Thanks all those who contributed into the chat box. None of those ideas and issues and concerns will go wasted, I can assure you. Really, it's been wonderful with you. And could I ask that the panelists don't disappear? This is not a zoom in and zoom out kind of thing. We're trying to build something, and we are collecting you as we go along because of your insights, your work, and of course, you know, the possibilities of building something bigger than we already have, right? You know, in the next webinar that's going to be taking place on the 19th, we'll be focusing on the violent state and dealing with repression, right? And here in this particular webinar, we've got some excellent speakers who they themselves have been part and parcel of the liberation struggle and civil disobedience against violent states in their respective countries. So we look forward to continuing this part of the discussion, and that is deconstructing violence. And then from there onwards, from webinar 4, 5, and 6, it'll be like sort of, in a sense, constructing the pathways to sort of just and peaceful and sustainable world. So let me thank the panelists. Let me thank the participants. I thank the MOVE team. And can we just say, pause for 5 seconds to digest all that we have taken on today. And from my side, let me say that peace be unto you and your loved ones. And we say goodbye and hopefully see you all soon. Thank you so much. And we say, yeah, Amangela, power to the people. Okay. All right, you may leave. I will just check with my team. Daria, Joseph.
Hi, Gino. We'll just leave the room open for a couple of more minutes as the feedback poll has been launched and we're still getting in some input.
Yeah, yeah,
so
please,
maybe one
please.
more minute. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry about that, Daria.
I'm going to have to rush to another meeting. Thank you so much, everyone. It's been such a pleasure to participate in this and lovely to meet you all. Hopefully our paths will cross again very soon.
Absolutely. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
I also must do the same, and I have a meeting coming up in a few minutes. But thank you all, truly, it's been an honor. Thank you. And I look forward to the recording because I'd like to listen again to what Philippe and Andrew were saying.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, no worries, Rania. Take care, right? And yeah, be in touch. Philippe.